You've entered Bookstorm with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Okay. Well, welcome to Bookstorm. We're super thrilled to have the author Christina Baker Kline with us today, the #1 New York Times best-selling author of 8 novels, including Exiles, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World. Christina is published in 40 countries. Her novels have been received the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, Barnes & Noble Discover Award, among others. Her books have been chosen by hundreds of communities, universities, and schools as a one-book, one-read selection. Not only this, she's the author and editor of 5 nonfiction works. She has essays, articles, and reviews that have appeared in publications like the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Psychology Today. The author, Paula McLean, New York Times bestselling author of Paris Wife, describes this book that we're here to talk to Christina about today, The Exiles, as a vivid and rewarding feat of both empathy and imagination. I love this book. Christina is a New York Times bestseller, Publishers Weekly bestseller, Indie bestseller, USA Today bestseller, and if I don't quit soon, we'll never get to the interview. She lives in New York and Southwest Harbor, Maine, with her husband and 3 boys. And Christina, thank you so much for joining us today. We are revved up. We are revved up about this book.
Well, what a great introduction. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Really happy to talk to you today.
Christina, we like to give our listeners a little bit of a background about the book. So if you'll indulge me, I just want to kind of summarize The Exiles from our perspective a little bit. We don't give away any spoilers, but your novel is just a sweeping historical novel that introduces us to so many incredible themes relating to oppression, injustice, the role of women in the 19th century. We follow the stories of a trio of women, one of them being Evangeline, who is just this very interesting figure because even though she has some education, the ability to read and to write and to teach, she finds herself in a situation where she is convicted of a crime and sent to a notorious prison, the Newgate prison in London. We see the conditions, the horrific conditions in this prison, and soon she finds that she is being shipped off. And I love how you put it, beyond the seas, to is it pronounced Van Diemen or Van Diemen's Island?
Van Diemen's Land, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And this is a penal colony in Australia. Some of our listeners may be familiar with the fact that the British Empire would ship convicts off to these islands into far-flung places, but women were being sent there. And the voyage and being on the ships just taking them to these horrific places in terms of the treatment they received there were also harsh and subjected to all kinds of abuse on the way. And there was, Evangeline's story is fascinating just from that standpoint. But we do see where her education affords her the opportunity to have better treatment than some of the other prisoners. We're introduced to Hazel. She is a person of a lower social status. She doesn't have some of the abilities that Evangeline does. And we see also where her very inconsequential crime has resulted in a harsh penalty, and she's also shipped off to this penal colony. We have another character that I thought was amazing, who is actually a historical figure. And I think I'm pronouncing it right, Mathina.
Yes.
Okay.
I've recently, because we're working on the film adaptation, we've been working with an Indigenous expert who pronounces it a little differently, Matina, I believe, but I had always heard it pronounced that way. So for the moment, I'm going to continue calling it Mathina. Yeah.
Okay. Well, she is also a fascinating character because she is Aboriginal. She is the daughter of a chieftain, but we see this British Empire coming in, and in the the colonization that takes place. These families are separated, their culture is wiped out. And I thought that the character herself was such a beautiful and horrible at the same time picture of what happens when we have these, the British Empire coming in and doing what they were doing at the time. So, in all, these three characters give us this incredible picture of oppression and injustice. But as a reader, we were thoroughly engaged and just amazed at how this book unfolded. So, kind of with that backdrop, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the facts. If we're ready to brave the storm,
we sure are. We sure are. So, Christina, you have woven this beautiful, important story that moves the reader to abhor ignorance and the pure evil of prejudice. In your book, set in the early 1800s, we see, as Kristen just said, poverty-stricken women judged wrongfully and sent into inhumane prison conditions. We see an innocent indigenous girl uprooted from her home, taken to a foreign land where she's just judged solely by her skin color. Your beautiful writing makes we as the reader empathize with these mistreated people, and we become angry, maybe even hateful and vengeful, but something more. You made us recognize that who are we today, and are we still exhibiting any of these prejudices? You kind of made us do a little introspection into our own society and our lives today. And I wondered, was this your intention, or did this story take you, even as the writer, into some feelings and emotions that maybe you didn't anticipate?
Oh my gosh, you put that so beautifully. Absolutely. I was overcome with sort of shock and anger, as you describe it, about the conditions for the women. But I also want to stress that their friendships were so important in this story. And, women helping women like you two together today, it's such a big part of my narrative and of all of my novels, I think, of looking at how people who are dealing with hardship can really come together to overcome individually, but also collectively. In Mathina's case, she was abandoned. She really didn't have people who were looking out for her once her parents died. She drew on her culture and her family background, I think, to try to survive in a world that was brutally difficult for her. But I also want to stress to readers that it's not all brutal. The story is about perseverance, and those women in Australia are foremothers of an entire world, an entire country, and 20% of Australians today are descended from convicts. For a long time, they had this sort of stain, the convict stain. People were afraid to talk about their past, and they didn't want to talk about coming over as convicts, or even generations into the future, they didn't. But now we've reached a point where Australians are more than happy to share their convict past. And in fact, they're proud of it. Because the truth is, most of the people who were sent there had committed what they called crimes of poverty. They hadn't, I think something like less than 3% had committed murder or a capital crime. They literally stole bread to get by. England in the 19th century, I'm sure you can imagine, was what we think of when the term Dickensian London comes to mind. There were no social programs, there was no social safety net, there was no welfare, there was no foster care. So if you were poor, you were really stuck at the bottom of the ladder. One of the wonderful things about the Australia story is, as hard as it was for those women, once they got there, they really had the chance for social mobility. in a way that they never would have had in England, where you're stuck where you're born. Your accent determines your entire future. If you're born in Glasgow in a slum, that's probably where you end up. They had workhouses and poorhouses, but really no social advancement. And Britain is better now, but it's still pretty class stratified compared to Australia, which is a very different feeling of a country, given that it was settled by the British and that it started with all British people, including in addition to the Aboriginal people who were already there. It's pretty interesting to look at how Britain and Australia are very different as countries.
Yeah, amazing. It's amazing. And the other thing that really hit us so strong with your beautiful story is that, what you just said, the stories of these women, both their hardship, but also their overcoming, is such a lesson to all of us. And, we as people can say to someone, I want you to feel this way. I want you to understand this. But what you did in the writing of this story and the formation of these beautiful characters is you made the reader feel one with that character. So you're not telling us what to believe here. You are helping us to feel those same emotions. And as you said, it's not all negative. There's a lot of really heartfelt desire to persevere and change their lives and become something different than the environment that they were born into. And it's an inspiration. This is the perfect example for us of how fiction can be life-changing.
I knew writing a story like this that it would feel very far away from people, like it's the early to mid 19th century. It's Australia. Many of my readers are American, although, it's published in other countries as well, but really the bulk of my readers are here. And so my goal was just to make it as visceral and human as possible so that you really are with Evangeline when she steps into that carriage and she's whisked away to Newgate Prison, and she's never experienced anything like it in her life. I envisioned the novel as a kind of passing of the baton from Evangeline to Hazel, and then eventually to Ruby, the child who's born, who sort of represents the next generation. And then Mathina's story is woven throughout. But I saw it as Evangeline passing on a number of gifts she has. One is the gift of literacy. We've talked about that she teaches Hazel to read. Evangeline herself loves to read. She loves The Tempest. The Tempest becomes a sort of metaphorical stand-in for this crazy place they're going that they didn't know anything about. She passes along her necklace, her tin ticket. She passes along a handkerchief that's important to her. She literally passes along a new life. And so that Hazel, who has many tools that Evangeline doesn't have to survive, she's grown up in this very hard world. She's got a superpower. She's a midwife, so she has the power to heal and also for ill if she wanted to. And that makes her powerful, and people want to barter with her so that they can use her services. So she has something to trade with, and that's something that Evangeline never had. She's a much more savvy character. And so I love that you start with a character who's kind of a stand-in for the reader. She herself is a reader, right? And she loves literature, but she doesn't quite have the skills that Hazel has to get by in the world. And so you go then, you move on to someone who really can guide the reader through this new world with her canny sense of people and her sort of spot on judgments. And even when she's at the lowest moment, her real will to survive. And then you end up with someone who has the benefit of both of those personalities and both of those experiences, who can move to a whole other level, which is what happened in Australia. And I love showing how Australia started as this purely penal colony. It's the only nation that has ever been founded as a penal colony. And it moves on to flourish as a real outpost for Britain, but eventually its own country. And it's because of the indomitable spirit of those people who settled the country to begin with.
Absolutely. And we can all relate to that and hopefully carry some of that with us into our own lives as an example. beautiful.
Yeah, I think a lot of people too are not familiar with the modern day history of Australia. And so that was eye-opening from that perspective.
Yeah, it was for me too. It was for me too. And also the incredible jaw-dropping fact that Australia was founded because they sent, essentially because America declared independence and we did not allow Britain to send their convicts here anymore. They sent 50,000 convicts here before we closed the doors. So then they looked wherever they could. They first considered sending convicts to Africa, and then, but the shoreline was too rocky and they couldn't figure it out. And then they looked to Australia, where the Dutch and the French were already, sort of putting their flags, and they marched in, as Britain does, and, decided that this was theirs. And so they sent all these men there. And by 1803, Australia was 9-1 men to women. So they literally started a government program to sweep women off the streets, to be breeders. And that was how the women got sent there, which is just mind blowing. If you think about it, like, how does a country have the right to do this? But they did. And that was how Australia got founded.
Wow, fascinating.
That really is. Christine, you had, in fact, I remember reading, I think that the state of Georgia was a place where convicts were sent.
That's right.
And
to work in the tobacco fields.
Yes, absolutely. You had mentioned a few minutes ago the idea of literacy and its importance in lifting the oppressed out of their circumstances and being a vehicle for being able to move forward. And I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit, because we see where literacy and education were central to some of the themes with these characters, but also there was something more, and that is these relationships that you were talking about. And I was wondering if you could just comment, is it simply a matter of throwing education at people, or do we need those foundational relationships in place too?
Well, we do, but I do truly believe that education is the key to pulling people out of poverty. My father was the first person in his entire family, like for generations, to finish not only college, but 8th grade. And he became a professor. It wasn't that long ago either. I mean, he was born in 1939, and no one in his family had finished 8th grade. And then because he did and went to college on a football scholarship, his family could never have afforded it. He then developed a love of education, and he became first a teacher, and then he went and got a PhD and became a professor. And so I grew up in this family with someone who was first generation college, and it had transformed his life, transformed his siblings' lives, transformed his children's lives. All of us in one way or another became either teachers, or one sister became a librarian, one became a therapist, one's in higher education, and I'm a writer. So none of that would have been possible without education. And just looking at how it can transform lives, it's in most of my books that there's some way in which getting an education can help lift people. And I believe in it so strongly. I work with a foster care organization that supports kids in foster care between the pivotal ages of 15 and 25. It's called Roots and Wings. Their point being that it's hard for little children, but when you're at that age, you're making decisions about the rest of your life that will impact everything. And so they help 15, 16-year-olds get their homework done, and figure out how to take standardized tests, and apply to college of any kind, or trade schools, just to lift them out. And I just think it's so, so important.
I think we come from a city where there is a very high population of immigrants, and including my own family. We immigrated from Italy, my great grandparents. And I love what you said, because my grandfathers worked in chemical factories in Niagara Falls. And then that next generation, my father and actually my uncle, had the ability to go to college, and also became teachers and other professions that then fostered a love of education now in my generation and beyond. And so I love what you said, because there is that foundation of encouragement and inspiration. and also then the tools through the education to go to that next level. So the organization you're involved with, I think that's wonderful, fantastic.
Yeah, it's such an amazing idea to do that, to focus on that age, group. Yeah.
And I think sometimes when you live in poverty conditions and you have no one in front of you to show you the way, to even show you how to fill out a college application, and maybe you don't have a computer, and maybe the government is saying you can go to school for free, but you say, well, I don't know one single person who did. This is the toughest thing, that you need this mentorship, one
Yes.
teacher or one person in your life to say, yes, even though it hasn't been done before in your family, you can do it. And you can be the first and be the leader for generation upon generation to come and start something new. I love that about the book, and I love that about your story. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Yeah.
One of the heroines in your book grows into an adult and uses her past tragedies and the pain of her childhood to make a difference in the world. I love this part of the story because she does not become the evil that hurt her. She does not become vengeful or even hateful, even though she's given an opportunity when she reunites. I don't want to give any spoilers. She actually becomes the exact opposite. She focuses on a purpose, a quest to change, to help others, and she enters the field of medicine. And we talked about this before. Did you start out with this intent in mind of showing the reader the power to overcome? I can't help but think that you're trying to show us that even in the worst histories, we can somehow turn around the sorrow or the hardship that we endured and sort of turn it into something good.
It's such a good question. When you're writing a novel, a lot of times you have or at least in my case, I had a sense of the story arc, the way it would go. And I had a little inkling that I might be able to go back to the very beginning of the story at the very end, that I might somehow get back there through one of the characters. But as I was going, I thought, well, maybe I'll just end the story right before that, so that there's not this coda of whatever it is, 20 pages, but you've got, you end in Australia and you sort of see that things are getting better, as they do generationally anyway, but it's certainly in my story, which I don't think is giving away anything to say, and maybe even makes people relieved because it's, but then I realized I had such an opportunity. One of the wonderful things about writing novels that are set in the past is that you stumble on all kinds of things that are true that you couldn't even have made up. Like, for example, Elizabeth Fry, who's a Quaker reformer in my novel, was a real person. And she was pretty complicated. I mean, she was helpful to the convict women, but she was also kind of judgmental about them. So having a real life person like that, whose writings I could draw on and who spoke some of the things that I have her say in the book, was really helpful. And then at the end of the story, I discovered that in 1899, a group of women opened the first hospital for women, all-female hospital in Melbourne, Australia. They all got qualified to become doctors, which at the time was shocking. And it was, I think, 11 women. And so I just have my character join that group. And I also discovered a woman in London who I describe in the novel, who had tricked her way into being a doctor. She had slid in without men realizing it. She'd been denied all these other ways. It was against the law, but she got qualified. And then she opened a hospital where she trained female doctors and nurses. And she brought people over from Australia. So that was a real detail in the novel that I was able to use. That was one of the most fun aspects of writing this book, is that I would find stories that I could really draw on as I wove them in and out of the fiction of the story.
And it went so smoothly. And I have to say, I loved the ending. I'm so glad you continued with those 20 pages at the end. Just perfect.
Yeah. Thank you. It's my most endy of my stories. Like, it really is an end. It's like the end. You could say the end.
Well, it's also that hope and that inspiration. As I became engrossed in the novel, the lack of power was very frustrating to me. I mean, I'm an attorney. I represent people who are in a position of lacking power. But at least in the United States, we have the Constitution, which provides rights and the ability to level the playing field. You know, for example, we have a right to counsel. We can appeal things. And these characters didn't always have those opportunities. And I was wondering if what do you think these three women who are very strong would be doing if they were in our society today?
Well, I again, education I think is key. It would matter that Hazel got educated, right? But I have no doubt that she would be a doctor and would be, using her skills to help people in that way. I think Evangeline could have done anything, but her problem was not that she wasn't educated, but that she was sort of blindered because she'd been raised by her father as a companion, as women often were, and had no real skills outside of the home. And so, she, even in the home, they had a housekeeper. She was really just expected to serve his needs, to help him with his pursuits. And so I think she would have been a more practical. She would have had a lot more opportunity today, probably. I could see Evangeline running all kinds of organizations. Maybe she would have become a lawyer.
We loved that part of the story because you had brought it up earlier, women helping women, women empowerment. And Kristen and I were talking a little before the podcast, and we said, if you think of it, women have felt and undergone a lot of prejudice through the years. We are a minority in its own right. And to see the strides that we've made and the things from our great-grandmothers till now, how very proud they would have been of us. And how I do believe a lot of that is women supporting women and fighting for women's rights and causes. And that comes out in this book. That theme comes out strong in this book that we as women can all relate to.
I was just reading actually that in the United States, I was literally reading this today because I'm working on a new book, that in the mid-19th century, a married woman was not allowed to own property, keep any money she might earn, sign a contract, make a will, vote. A widow could not even be the guardian of her own children.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing. It is amazing.
And how far we've come. Yeah.
And how far we've come and still ways to go. And just inspirational from the start to the ending. This book, total inspirational. And I think it's going to change a lot of readers' lives, the way that they look at things. But back to what you just said, what's on your radar? You're mentioning another book that you're writing now?
Yeah, I'm writing a new novel that is set in Civil War era North Carolina, and it's based on a family story. So I'm struggling along with it, but hopefully it'll be done in a few months.
Oh, well, we can't wait. We're definitely going to be looking forward to that book coming out.
Thank you.
Just
so
to
much.
let our readers know, you can connect with Christina Baker Kline on her website, ChristinaBakerKline.com, or you can even subscribe to her newsletter there. You can find her on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and we highly recommend any of these books that she's written. But right now, we are loving The Exiles. Thank you, Christina.
Thank
Pleasure
you so
meeting you.
much for having me. I really had a ball. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Boy, that was a lot of discussion and powerful themes going on there, Kristen.
Absolutely.
And the one thing that hit me the strongest is this notion of being wrongfully judged. So a lot of the characters in Christina's novel went to very inhumane prison conditions because of accusations that were unfounded or small crimes that did not justify the punishment. And I think in life, even in today's society, being wrongfully accused and wrongfully judged is a horrible thing. And it can take a lot of forms. It could be simply, we know this happens, someone looks at you and they decide, I don't like you. Or maybe you mention a phrase or a comment, someone hears it and they decide, I don't like that person. Or let's take it a step further. Maybe you are accused of a crime and you go to trial and you're wrongfully convicted. And I have to ask you, as a lawyer, as an attorney, have you ever seen any of this, wrongful accusations? And if so, how did you handle them?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. First of all, I'm going to back up because when I read this book, it made me appreciate so much the fact that we have a constitution that guarantees to us certain rights. Because think about the difference in our modern day times versus what they were dealing with in England at the time. I mean, we have a right to counsel, right? We have a lawyer who will be assigned to us if we're too poor. These women did not. We have a right to be free from cruel and unusual punishments. They did not have that. We had a woman in the book who was sentenced to 7 years for stealing a spoon. And thankfully, we have those safeguards. But to speak to your question, we also have safeguards where, for example, the government cannot take things away from us unjustly. We can sue based on some of those constitutional guarantees. And again, it levels the playing field. There's a little bit of a balancing of power. When my clients or people who come to me with a problem have been wrongfully deprived of their property or of their lives, well, we can do a number of things, one of which is we can file a lawsuit. And those constitutional guarantees are something that we can pursue legally. Now, unfortunately, in our system of justice, we compensate people with money for the most part. But, aside from that, there is that idea of having vindication, of having your day in court and being able to say, this is a wrong thing that occurred and I'm doing something about it. Mm-hmm. Now, you started out with your question talking about people not liking you. Yes, that can occur at any time. People can, dismiss what I'm wearing, or they don't like my hairstyle. We can't do much about some of those things, right? No. But when it's the government doing it on the basis of gender or your nationality, your race, or your religion, well, then in the United States, at least, we have a way to right some of those wrongs.
Mm-hmm. And I love the way you said in the United States, because there's a lot of countries that do not possess those rights, and people still are being unjustifiably imprisoned with very harsh judgments and sentencing that does not really equate to the crime they committed. And I guess the only thing, my takeaway, because I'm always more emotional thinker here, is that, all right, I can't help how someone wrongfully judges me, but I can try to be fair in my judgments of others. So I have control over nobody, but I do have control over myself. And so this book sort of made me take a look back and say, I am not a prejudiced person. I'm here to tell you I'm not. I don't think I am. But do I judge people incorrectly? Now and then? Maybe I do. And maybe I need to just step back and cut people a break a little bit. See where they're coming from. What's their history? Where's their environment? And maybe give a second and third chance now and then. That was my little takeaway of that.
Yeah. Well, that's also the role of empathy, mm-hmm. right? When we have empathy towards others, we don't forgive all trespasses in terms of, allow them to continue doing wrong things, but we look at their circumstances, we look at their words they're using in light of a lot of different factors.
Mm-hmm. We talked about this a little bit last podcast, this notion, concept of boundaries, that yes, we can still interact with all types of different people, but we are allowed to set a boundary and say, you have proven hurtful in the past, and so you can't cross this line anymore. It's a very healthy thing. So what's on your radar? Tell me a little bit, like what you've been thinking of, what's your takeaway, what do you have planned?
Yeah, well, this book really made me think about the concept of injustice. I think about that a lot, especially environmental injustice, but I realized how important fiction is for shining a light on some of these wrong things. And, in this situation, I didn't have a good understanding of Australia's modern day history. I didn't understand fully what had happened to, for example, the Aboriginal people and how their culture was basically destroyed by the British colonists. And so shining a light on these injustices, I think, is so important because it also helps us in our modern times to make sure we don't repeat those mistakes. I think we need to understand history so that we go forward and we do things better. We do it with more wisdom. We approach it with more empathy. How about you, Chris?
I love that. I love that you said that. And I have to add this. So that really is what this podcast is about. We tell the author when we come on here, we are a different kind of podcast. We're talking about fiction, and fiction is pretend. But fiction is based on reality of what we already know to be true in life. And in every fiction book, or at least the books that Kristen and I choose for the podcast, there are going to be themes and little golden nuggets that you can take away that are going to maybe not so much always change your life, but allow you to consider or think of something in a different way from what you did before, because that's what these books have done for us.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Well, even just seeing women in a strong position and having that role model, so to speak, I think is fantastic.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I guess my one takeaway is, all right, I've got 28 nieces and nephews, 2 kids, and a son-in-law, and my son's beautiful girlfriend. And what my takeaway is, I have already, but I'm going to continue to instill into these kids' lives that it does not matter. We all make mistakes. We all make wrong choices. These are not wasted days. These are not wasted years. Do not have regret. Take what you've learned. Help somebody else through it. Make a difference in somebody else's life. Teach somebody something. And in any case, use it to grow stronger, because that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, beautifully put.
Thank you. So that's all for now. Thank you for joining us today on Bookstorm Podcast. A big shout out to our incredibly talented sound engineer, the Mr. Mark Carey, who we would not be doing this well without his expertise in this regard. And we're leaving you with a few Bookstorm predictions to pique your interest, or maybe you want to read ahead. Upcoming, we have the author Christina McMorris and her incredible book, Sold on a Monday. We have Laura Morelli and her beautiful story, The Stolen Lady. And we have Samantha Woodruff with her eye-opening book, The Lobotomist's Wife. In the meantime, stay on the radar with Kristen and me by visiting our website at bookstormpodcast.com, our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and if you'd like to see us in person, or better yet, one of our amazing authors, you can view the video portion of this podcast on YouTube. Until next time, the best way to brave the storm is to do a deep dive into life-changing fiction.